I started getting symptoms of menopause much earlier than a lot of my girlfriends. Every 3 minutes or so, I would just be on fire.
In the prefrontal cortex, 50% of your neurons contain estrogen receptors, right? Half of the neurons in your frontal lobe. And this suggests that this hormonal signal of estrogen is like a major organizing principle of how the brain operates.
From Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City, this is Your Brain with Dr. Phil Stieg. Internationally renowned scientist and researcher, Dr. Stieg is neurosurgeon-in-chief of New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. This week, Dr. Stieg and his guest explore menopause and the brain.
Today I have with me Dr. Emily Jacobs. Emily is a neuroscientist at the University of California, Santa Barbara in psychological and brain sciences. Currently, she focuses on sex hormones and their influences on brain function. In particular, brain changes that occur around menopause. Emily, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
How long is the typical menopause period? And as I understand it, there are specific stages in menopause. Can you describe that for me?
Menopause is a transition. It starts with a fully reproductively capable woman with regular menstrual cycles. And we enter sort of a late reproductive stage, and then perimenopause, where we start to see infrequent cycles. They may grow shorter or longer in length. And this is where we get a lot of kind of turbulence, where hormone levels can have a much greater dynamic range, but eventually starts to fall down. And by postmenopause, which is defined as 12 months, 1 year without any cycle, ovarian hormone levels have declined by about 90%. So that's estrogen and progesterone from your ovaries. Those levels have really plummeted.
Can you tell me what kind of emotional and physiologic changes women experience when going through menopause? And then why do others not experience any of those at all?
When we talk about these hormonal changes where you have this 90% decline in the production of ovarian hormones, those hormones are going to act on a lot of different bodily systems, right? Not just the brain. And that's the power of hormones. Hormones do not have targeted effects. They have sweeping effects across an organism. But from a brain perspective, we know that about 40% of women will experience brain fog.
Permanent or temporary?
Well, that is the question. And for most women, it's likely temporary, that it's driven by the perimenopausal state where these hormones are really showing these large dynamic changes. But by postmenopause, these are self-described cognitive changes, which are real. But when we put them, when we bring women into the lab and give them a whole battery of cognitive tests, there are very few that are going to pick up these sorts of subtle cognitive differences. We know women don't go crazy through the menopausal transition, right? We've got plenty of evidence that that's not the case. But that's not to say that these changes that they're experiencing aren't real. And one of the goals of my lab and many others who are focusing on this is to try to understand kind of what's going on under the hood in terms of their brain structure and function that might make some women more susceptible to those cognitive changes.
Emily, I don't think most of the population really understands how much of an endocrine organ the brain really is. Can you clarify that for us?
Sure. When we say that the brain is an endocrine organ, we mean that in a couple different ways. So the brain, and particularly a region called the hypothalamus, which sits right at the base of your brain, produces hormones. It guides the production of hormones from other organs, other peripheral endocrine glands in your body. So there's this tightly coordinated, what we call a neuroendocrine cascade, where your brain, through the production of hormones in the brain itself, can guide the production of hormones in places like your testes or your ovaries. And then the loop comes back full circle, where those hormones like estrogens and progesterones and testosterone that are produced by these endocrine glands travel through your bloodstream, and those hormones can bind to receptors that are also in your brain.
A lot of my friends who've never experienced menopause symptoms have asked me what it feels like. And the only thing I can compare it to is like being on a Coney Island roller coaster. So my brain and body feels like it's climbing towards some sort of the top of something, and then the heat is the ride down.
So I don't think we touched clearly upon why some women have brain fog and others don't.
You know, the spectrum goes through from women who experience no symptoms whatsoever, in fact, don't even know that they've gone through menopause if, you know, they're not tracking their cycles. I mean, really, truly just sail through, to women who become debilitated and experience what can be quite severe forms of perimenopausal depression, severe vasomotor hot flashes, brain fog, and it is a complete spectrum from one end to the other. Most women will not experience these sort of severe outcomes, but some will, and we need to be able to speak to the entire population and understand what may be driving those individual differences, and of course, consider these women, in a nuanced way that appreciates that full spectrum. One of my favorite statistics is that in the prefrontal cortex, 50% of your neurons, 50% of them contain estrogen receptors, right? Half of the neurons in your frontal lobe express estrogen receptors, which,
Men and women?
to the best of our knowledge.
Yeah.
And this suggests that this hormonal signal of estrogen is like a major organizing principle of how this region of the brain operates. So a critical question is, for women, when you go through menopause and you lose the ovarian production of this hormone, how do these regions of the brain respond? And that is exactly the question that my lab is trying to answer.
As I was listening to you, I was thinking about, my mother. She was going to menopause and she had a hysterectomy. That's the way they treated it back then. And they put them on hormonal replacement.
Estradiol, the major form of estrogen in mammals, is neuroprotective. And you can remove the animal's ovaries and show that it causes havoc on these regions of the brain that contain estrogen receptors. You give estrogen back and, all is right with the world in a sort of simplistic way. Mm-hmm. So the first female director of the NIH was Bernadine Healy. And her major initiative was something called the Women's Health Initiative. Just to give you insight into the thinking at the time, this was going to be the gold standard, right? A randomized clinical control trial in a huge population, the first one to really test in women whether HRT was neuroprotective.
HRT?
Hormone replacement therapy.
Okay.
And the Institute of Medicine at the time came out with a position statement that said, we think running this randomized clinical trial is unethical because the benefits of estrogen are so obvious. Okay, so that's just to clue you into the thinking of the time. They didn't want to run the study. Fast forward several years later, and that clinical trial ended early because of the opposite effects, right? Adverse effects on stroke and other outcomes. The field, you could just hear the screech breaks, right? Of doctors around the world taking women off HRT. And the number of prescriptions for hormone replacement therapy had plummeted in the months after that report came out. The problem is that they threw the baby out with the bathwater. That study enrolled women who were on average age 75, right? Decades after they've gone through the menopausal transition, and the brain is going to be different. And you're suddenly reintroducing this now foreign hormone to a brain that has gotten used to being without it. So it was not answering the question of whether hormone replacement therapy in sort of a critical window of this transition state might be beneficial. And we're really kind of still trying to pick up the pieces and understand the potential utility of hormone therapy.
So it's amazing. In 2021, we're still in kind of a primitive level in terms of understanding all of this stuff.
We really are.
When I was in menopause, I would wake up every night at 4 o'clock in the morning, stressed and anxious, stare out my window and not be able to fall back asleep. But the good news is it doesn't last forever.
Couldn't sleep, couldn't think, head in a fog the whole time. It was like an endless hangover with no liquor.
I love menopause because I stopped having migraine headaches. I wasn't having to plan my life around monthly migraines.
Actually, the biggest changes were all of a sudden I'm putting on weight in places where I never have before. I am much rounder and squishier without changing anything else about my diet or habits.
Hot flashes interrupt my sleep, and so I'll wake up several times at night, and that affects how I am during the day. I'm groggy, I can't remember things, I'm not top of my game at all.
Perhaps because my periods were difficult and intense, when menopause hit, I felt a burst of creative energy and alertness in my body and mind.
I went to see so many different doctors and gynecologists because this was really something that was actually pretty debilitating during certain stages. I guess what frustrates me the most is how varied and inconsistent medical response is.
What can women do, when they're 30, to ease the impact of menopause?
First, let's just normalize menopause instead of making this taboo topic. Let's talk about it, right? Even just from a sort of cultural perspective, because a lot of women will experience these brain fog changes and be terrified that this means they're on the route to Alzheimer's disease. And in most cases, that's not true. So what we can do as scientists is to try to help figure out what of those sort of subpopulation of women is vulnerable. And we're not there yet. We don't have the answer, but let's start by investing in women's health research from a national federal funding perspective, because these questions should have answers already, and they don't. You know, one of the benefits that just happened a few years ago was just getting a taxonomy of menopause. And so there was something called the Stages of Reproductive Aging workshop, which convened endocrinologists to get together so that we could have a working definition of menopause. And through
So you're telling me this is recent?
This probably in the last 10 years.
Really?
Right.
See, that amazes me that it took that long.
Right. It is a insight into how often women's health is just swept under the rug, which is maybe what we can get into later.
What do we know about a woman that has one child versus a woman that has 6 children? Does that have an impact on menopause?
That's an interesting question. So a friend and colleague of mine, Anne-Marie Delange, who's in Europe, she just published a really interesting paper, and she shows that the more women that have more children actually show younger brain age post-menopause. So there does seem to be this kind of protective role of maybe because of the brain has been bathed in estrogen during each of those pregnancies to kind of create these neuroprotective effects. We don't know the mechanism.
Do people that have more babies, do they have more of these estrogen receptors in their brain that's beneficial?
We don't know. We do not know at the receptor level, but she used data from 12,000 middle-aged women and found that women who had multiple children showed younger looking brains relative to women who didn't have children.
What's a younger looking brain mean?
Yeah. So these are sort of great question. And these are kind of statistical tricks where we can anticipate what. So she's using brain structure.
So you're looking at cell counts and
volume of different regions, and we would expect a certain amount of, say, atrophy or changes. And in women that had given birth many times, they were sort of behind the curve. They showed less of these brain aging biomarkers than women who had not ever given birth.
I just want to be really clear so that those listening walk away with the right messages. So what you are saying is that having multiple children may be protective from a menopause standpoint and also from a onset of dementia standpoint.
That is what this one study has showed. Now, that shouldn't be a reason why people should feel bad about not having children, but understanding why that association was found is now the critical question. Does it have to do with the hormonal changes experienced in pregnancy, or what is it about that link that's causal? And we don't know yet.
What I do want the listeners to be able to walk away with is, what are your recommendations from a endocrine health standpoint?
Well, use your voice. When you go into your primary care physician because you have severe cramps or because you want to go on birth control for reproductive reasons, ask, what are the side effects of these medications? And read the literature, read the popular press, educate yourself if your doctor won't do it for you. For most women, going on estrogen replacement therapy early in the menopausal transition, it's not the scary monster that we thought it was. There is now good evidence to suggest that for most women, this can be a really safe option. You certainly should have this conversation with your doctor about when to start it, about how long to stay on it. I think the official recommendation from what's called the North American Menopause Society is that using it for 5 years is fine. And for many women, this can relieve symptoms of hot flashes, of vaginal dryness, of brain fog, and it should be a tool that you consider using.
And it seems to me that the other message would be that we need to transform this from a, psychological problem.
Absolutely.
And people need to understand this. This is not, just something that happens willy-nilly.
Yes, it is biological. We can point to something physical in the brain that for some women is changing. On the other hand, it is worth noting, as you've said, that some women go through menopause and are just fine, and that's great. There are individual differences and variability, and so talk to your doctor about potential changes. If you are one of the women that is experiencing side effects, there are options for you.
Emily Jacobs, you are clearly passionate, clearly driven, and clearly focused on menopause and female health issues. God willing, you'll win a Nobel Prize. But even if you don't, I know you're going to help many women understand their own biology. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
This classic episode of This Is Your Brain with Dr. Phil Steeg was produced for the Weill Cornell Medicine Department of Neurosurgery by the Really Interesting Picture Company. The episode producer was Geraldine Abinader. Social media management by Jillian Jean Creative. The series is directed and edited by Tom Veltri with music by Lenny Williams. The announcer is Mindy Weisberger. For more information, visit our website at thisisyourbrain.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to follow Dr. Steeg on Facebook at This Is Your Brain.